So, for years, there's been a mystery that many have wanted to solve. And that mystery is the mystery of the Fifth Beatle. Now, in this enigma, there are many suspects. While in most cases one has to sort through several suspects who are trying to seem as if they are not the culprit, in this case, you have to search through several suspects who want to be the culprit. And I'm not sure if that makes it harder, but maybe it does. Now, who is the Fifth Beatle? Is it this guy? Or maybe this dude? Or him or her? Or them? Or that person? Maybe that lady? Or that dude over there? I don't know. I could go on for days, but I don't want to go on for days. In order to avoid doing so, why don't we take a more methodical approach to discovering the identity of the Fifth Beatle? I'm going to split this up into sections. Section 1, the musicians. Now, of the Fifth Beatles, one that we hear thrown around a lot is Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles, before they opted for Ringo Starr and removed him from the band. But his story is fairly well known because he has done a fairly good job of publicizing himself. You know, if you look into it enough, you can definitely see his story. And a lot of times when you hear his story, it is told by him or in association with him. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. Now, the story goes that the other Beatles were jealous of his success, and so they kicked him out. And while, it is possible that that was true, if you look at his story overall, it's that he was kicked out of the Beatles for being too handsome and too popular. And to be honest, that doesn't quite add up to me. So, I think we can rule him out as a suspect for the Fifth Beatle. But when we're looking back at the early Beatles, what about Stu Sutcliffe, an early bass player for the Beatles? In fact, he was the bass player until his Paul replaced him, and he unfortunately died back in the early days. What contributions make him close to being a Fifth Beatle? Well, he was credited, along with Klaus Vormann, who I'll get to later, with coming up with the Beatle haircut. And he was also supposedly credited with coming up with the name. But that's really unknown. So, while he might have a little bit of a better case than Pete Best, even though he wasn't around as long, just because of his influence, I still think that, he wasn't there when the Beatles were really the Beatles. So, he can't be the Fifth Beatle. When we're talking about the early days, as I mentioned, Klaus Vormann, a friend of the band, definitely deserves recognition. He's been called the Fifth Beatle before. I think he was credited with the haircut, creating the haircut or something. And I think he also played bass on with them sometimes, and in the later years on some solo albums. But his influence just wasn't as large as it could have been, and I don't think that he truly is the Fifth Beatle. Then there was Tony Sheridan, and they actually backed him up in Germany because he was originally more popular, and they played under the name of the Beat Brothers with him. And to be honest, again, his overall impact on the band I don't think was large enough for him to be given the coveted title of Fifth Beatle. But once we move away from the very early days, the pre-recording days, when you look at their first single as the Beatles, Love Me Do, another figure pops up. Andy White, a session drummer who played on that record instead of Ringo, and according to some, played on a lot of other early records, though he was uncredited. Now, a lot of people dismiss the fact that he played on any but the first, but he definitely hinted at it. But the Beatles did a lot more than just drumming. They did a lot more than just their first albums. So, drum contribution on first album with no publicism, that's just not, doesn't make the cut. Now, there are a million other musicians I can mention who had an influence on them, who showed up to play some of their gigs, who, you know, filled in a spot while one of them was sick when they were on tour. But to be honest, I don't want to do all that. I just kind of went over some that I've seen thrown around a lot. But there is one more of the Fifth Beatle musicians, and that's Billy Preston, because of his contributions to Let It Be. And I think he has a couple of tracks on Abbey Road. And I have to say, the organ playing on that is definitely very distinctive. And his touch can be felt more there than others' touch on the band. Like, you don't notice Andy White's session drumming, like, what's that? It just kind of fills in the background. But, if you watch any clips from Let It Be, it seems like they definitely treat Billy Preston as almost an equal to the band when he's there, at least from what I've seen. And so I think he's actually a fairly good candidate for the musicians, but just appearing a lot alongside them on their final album, I mean, maybe at that time he was the Fifth Beatle, but overall, it's just, can't be possible. If you were to ask this question to a conspiracy theorist, you wouldn't get an answer of musicians. You would, of course, get an answer of the person who replaced Paul McCartney after his death in 1966. Some say it's Billy Shears. Most affectionately refer to this man as Fall, the fake Paul, a look-alike, sound-alike, and act-alike, who was hired, some say by the CIA. It just depends on your source, because while I find conspiracy theories interesting, my one problem with them is they are never consistent. I've definitely liked the Paul is dead theory. Looking at the clues, I don't really believe in it, but it is kind of interesting. A lot of it is more than a stretch. But when we are talking about this section with the Paul is dead section, there is only one real person confirmed as real. I mean, Paul might be dead. The lookalike might be the Fifth Beatle. We don't know. But there's only one real person that we know of who could even slightly hold the title of the Fifth Beatle in this section. And that is Fred Laborde, also known as Too Slim or Side Meat. Though the theory existed beforehand, he helped propel the theory with a newspaper article. And, if you watch fairly in-depth videos on it, on the theory, that are not made by crazy conspiracy theorists, you will definitely see mention of him, because he did it as a joke, and he actually created a lot of the popular myths, like Paul is barefoot because it's representing death, things like that. And people say, oh, that's just made up. Of course it is. He made it up. And I actually, on this subject, I saw him with his band Riders in the Sky, a cowboy band, and I was privileged enough to get him to sign a copy of Abbey Road here. And when I got him to do it, he said no one had ever done it before, meaning that's a unique item. But aside from that little tangent, probably not the Fifth Beatle, as far as I can tell. But why don't we probe deeper? We've got the musicians, blah, blah. But what about the actual, for real candidates? And, one thing that's good to do with mysteries is, before all the people were like, oh, it's me, look back to the original suspect. That would be Murray the K, self-proclaimed Fifth Beatle in 1964. He was an American DJ who helped them get radio play. He called himself the Fifth Beatle. I think he was the first to hold that title. But overall, he's the classic, but I think we have to probe deeper. There's Neil Aspinall, a good friend of Paul and George, I believe, at school. At least a friend. I don't know how good of friends they were. but he later became a roadie for the Beatles, a personal assistant, and eventually the CEO of their company, Apple. So he was a fairly big deal behind the scenes, especially by the end. But again, there are others who had a larger influence on the band than he did. We have the assistant of their manager, Derek Taylor, who is often credited with the press coverage, which helped them blow up. Again, press, all these things kind of work together, but they're not really a fifth Beatle. Now we get into the finals for the fifth Beatle. Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles until his death in 1967. He discovered them. He was called the fifth Beatle by the Beatles themselves. He went everywhere with them. He was obviously a huge part of the band. Some say his death kind of spelled out the end for the band. And overall, I think he's a very strong candidate. He's one of the people who had the biggest impact on them. But there is one other who transcends these categories. Yes, he was behind the scenes, but he was also doing the music too. My personal choice for the fifth Beatle, my favorite suspect, though I can't say if I'm right or not, and that, of course, is George Martin, their producer. Now, he produced them from the beginning, almost up to the end. There were a few spots where they went out on their own without him. Let It Be, where they didn't have him, was noticeably worse. The production was, awful. That was the only really, really bad part of the album, which kind of forced Paul to release Let It Be Naked later on. He didn't just do the behind-the-scenes stuff from the very beginning, as I said. He also helped, obviously, achieve the sounds they wanted, but most of all, he played piano on some of their albums and was responsible for a lot of their really great arrangements. When they used classical instruments and things like that, he would write it out. Sometimes he would transcribe it, he would arrange it from, the more simplistic melodies that the Beatles came up with themselves. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. I would put him forth as the fifth Beatle. That's just me. That's just my conclusion. And there are more suspects which I haven't covered. I would put money on the Queen of England, but I don't have enough evidence for that yet. And yes, that's it, I guess. Normally I'd go to an outro, singing an artist's music or a parody or something, but this video is about the Beatles, and I'll get sued to oblivion. But I'll try anyway. You really can't play Beatles music, but I bet we can sneak something past the algorithm. Let's try one more time.